Well, if you think about it, in the beginning of March, an hour before free practice 1 in Australia, glued to your TV, ready to go racing, and all of a sudden it gets called off. And then you started realizing that this COVID-19 pandemic was really, really serious. And what Formula One, together with the various motoring administrations in various countries, the governments of various countries, the World Health Organization, they managed to put together a calendar which had initially started off at 8 races, then it was going to go up to 10, then eventually they said we're going to be hopefully between 17 and 19 races. And from the 5th of July, and we've got our final race coming up, in the space of 6 months, they've put on 17 races. I mean, the guys, the drivers, the teams, the crews, the families are exhausted. But it's quite incredible of when you work properly and you plan things unbelievably well, that they managed to put a season on of 17 races. There were 3 triple headers where you had 3 races in a row. I think we had 3 Grand Prix where there were double up of Grand Prix as well. We had the first one in the Red Bull Ring, then we had Silverstone, and now we had Bahrain as well, where we had 2 races at each of these venues. Plus we had new tracks that came onto the circuit, which was incredible. Portimao in Portugal, where everyone's been desperate to go and race. We had a race over there. We had 3 races in Italy, Imola, Monza and Mugello. So it created a different kind of an energy. Yes, we didn't have fans in the stadiums or around the circuits, but I think, you know, compliments to Formula One and the FIA and all of the motorsport organizations around the globe for putting on 17 races and 2 COVID cases, one of them Lewis Hamilton and one of them Sergio Perez, besides a couple of other crew. It is run magnificently, I think better than anybody could have anticipated. Yeah, exactly, and you know, you bring up such a good point, because if you do have big accidents, whether it happens in free practice or qualifying or in the race, and you've got a race immediately the following weekend, it's not as though you can, because of what the COVID regulations were in various countries, you can just fly a whole crew back. So there was incredible how all of the teams managed to have enough spares for all of their cars throughout the whole season. And if you actually look at the a race 2 races ago in Bahrain, where Sergio Perez's car basically went on fire, and then Lance Stroll landed up on the bottom side where his car basically flipped over. It was incredible. Mr. Stroll, Lawrence Stroll's private jet, was there and was flying into England on special clearance to pick up parts and bring them back to the circuit. So yeah, it's just quite phenomenal that we put on 17 races. I think it's really quite fantastic. Lewis Hamilton, the results speak for themselves. He's won 11 races this year. He's missed out on 1. He more than likely in the last race, if he does race, most probably win that, so it'll be 12. He's broken all of Michael Schumacher's records. He's a 7 times world champion. Haters are going to be haters. This is unfortunately in any form of sport. People who achieve this kind of success are going to get people who are not going to be appreciative of their talents. And of course there are other questions, and I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later, about Mercedes itself. But regardless of what package you have to have a driver that can deliver. And Lewis Hamilton has got that ability. He's got the experience. He's been racing since 2007, and he knows how to win. And that's what makes him such a great champion. Whether he's the greatest of all time, the GOAT of Formula One, I think is irrelevant. You cannot compare Juan Manuel Fangio to Ayrton Senna, to Michael Schumacher, to Sebastian Vettel. You can't even compare Sebastian Vettel to Lewis Hamilton, because they raced together over a period of time, and Vettel won 4 championships. They raced again for a period of time, and Hamilton's gone on to win 6 championships. So who is the better of the two? What, because of 2 championships? The eras are completely different. But Lewis Hamilton is without a doubt one of the most extraordinary talents Formula One has been blessed to see. And love him or hate him, believe me, I don't think he loses sleep about the haters. Mercedes is doing everything right, and they have since they put together their dream team. You know, if you go back in Williams, you had Adrian Newey and Patrick Head in those years. And then, of course, you had the Schumacher era where you had Ross Brawn and Jean Todt, etc., Rory Byrne. Then you had the Vettel era where you had Adrian Newey again. And then, of course, now you've got this Mercedes era where you had Niki Lauda, you've got Toto Wolff, you had Ross Brawn, you've got, Andrew Shovlin, you've got the other Ferrari guy, I forget his name, who's there, James Allison. They are a complete team. They are incredibly well run. I think Toto Wolff must be quite difficult to work for, but what he has done and achieved is extraordinary. So Mercedes are doing every single thing right. But it must be said that ever since the beginning of the hybrid era in 2014, we have never ever had such a disparity when it comes to engine power. So the hybrid engine, everyone sat there and thought Renault, Ferrari, Mercedes sat there and went, oh, okay, you know, we've done our homework, we're going to go out there, watch us, we're going to go and impress. And Mercedes came out and on day one were 2 seconds faster than anybody else. And that got Renault, Ferrari, and of course Honda eventually head scratching because they sat and went, now how do we catch up? And this is where the fundamental problem is. The rules that were put in place at the introduction of the hybrid era unfortunately did not allow for R&D when it came to engine development. So all of a sudden, for the first 3 years, Ferrari and Renault were stuck with what they had. There was nothing else they could do. So Mercedes from there just sat and went, okay, as soon as these guys sit and have cottoned on to what we're doing, we're already 5 steps ahead. And that has been an unfortunate side of a little bit of this too much domination. If you just look at the stats of what Mercedes have achieved from the beginning of the hybrid era to now, it'll blow your mind. It makes Schumacher's records, Vettel's records completely insignificant. But take nothing away from Mercedes. What they have done has put together an incredible team. They've got an incredible driver in Lewis Hamilton and also no slow coach in Valtteri Bottas. So they deserve all of the plaudits. I would personally just like to see that Ferrari, Honda, Renault and Mercedes all have the same power output. That's all. Give them the same power output. For the rest of it, then it's up to the designers, the engineers and the driver. Vital. And I think it's about management. It's about how do you manage people. That's what it's all about. Yes, Toto Wolff is an ex-racing driver. Christian Horner is an ex-racing driver. So you sit and say, well, maybe they know the ins and outs of how to, the technical, how to deal with the technical people. Flavio Briatore, who ran brilliantly with Renault, came from the fashion industry. Didn't know anything about cars, couldn't care about cars, but knew how to manage people. And if you know how to manage people and get them to all work together in a very high ego-driven sport like Formula One, you're doing a phenomenal job. I mean, you just look back in the history, Jean Todt at Ferrari, Toto Wolff at Mercedes, Christian Horner at Red Bull, Patrick Head and Sir Frank Williams at Williams, in their time as well. So a team principle is exceptionally important. And this year, there have been a lot of questions asked about Mattia Binotto at Ferrari. Is he the right person? And in some ways you can say you've got to apportion some blame to him. And in other ways there are a whole lot of other factors that people aren't aware of that have turned it into the season that they've had. It's such a great question to understand why there are more manufacturers in Formula One. And we have to go back. You've got to go back to the Max Mosley era when he was the head of the FIA. And the one thing he did warn, and the same as Bernie Ecclestone said, if you allow these manufacturers to take over the sport, you're going to have a problem. It must be governed by Formula One. And as we've progressed, when the world of Formula One also decided they needed to go a little bit greener, green conscious, and they decided on hybrid technology, there were certain players prior to that who decided, listen, we're getting out. Toyota got out, BMW got out. They said, no, we've had enough. Ferrari's always been there. Mercedes were committed. Renault were half committed and then sat and said, okay, we'll get on board. And then only later did we get Honda that came in. So from these rules and regulations in terms of the power unit, because it's not really an engine anymore, but this power unit are now going to extend up until the end of the 2025 Formula One season. However, even teams like Mercedes have said we need to bring this forward. And I think they are correct, because the only way you're going to attract perhaps people with this kind of hybrid technology like Toyota, and we've seen how magnificent they've been in endurance racing like Le Mans, is to sit there and change it so that you can get people like Toyota and any other manufacturer, perhaps even BMW or Porsche, to get themselves into Formula One, because this now becomes a wonderful test bed for the future technology of where they're going to be when it comes to road-going cars, and taking nothing away from electric vehicles, because I think that is very much a future of road-going cars, but not necessarily the future of motorsport racing. Yeah, is it the car? Is it the driver? Let's have a look at exactly what happened over the past weekend when, unfortunately, Lewis Hamilton contracted COVID and is in recovery, which is great news. But there was this opportunity, and Mercedes, of course, had a third driver in Stoffel van Doorn, but also on their books they do have George Russell, who races for Williams, and everyone wanted to see George Russell in that Mercedes. So let's just clarify a couple of things first. George Russell, in any category of formula that he's raced, has dominated and has beaten. You take the likes of Lando Norris, Alexander Albon, who are in Formula One right now. George Russell wiped it clean when he raced against these guys. He just, unfortunately and fortunately, because no disrespect to Williams, is in the Williams seat, and he's not in a McLaren seat, and he's not in a Mercedes seat, and he's not in a Red Bull seat. So number one, you got to sit there and say George Russell is a very, very competent racing driver, does know the car because he has driven it in testing. Having said that, could you just put any other driver in the car? I'm not going to mention names, but I could mention maybe a handful that are on the grid at the moment who wouldn't have been able to do the job that George Russell did, okay, when it came to this specific race. But a very interesting point to remember, George Russell is 6'1". Lewis Hamilton is about 5'7". Whether you drive a Toyota Aygo or a Mercedes-Benz GLE, when you get into that car, it is relatively comfortable. When you get into a racing car, racing cars are not built for comfort. They are built to the specifications of what the aerodynamicists and engineers want. George Russell could hardly fit in that car. His knees were just about at his ears. He had to wear a pair of racing boots one size smaller than what he actually wears, just so that he could get his feet onto the pedals. His shoulders came out bloodied because they were pushing up against the rests. So kudos to George Russell for, number one, being able to do 87 laps. Is it just the car for Lewis Hamilton? No, it's not just the car. It is his ability. But this also showed the massive gap between Mercedes and everybody else. Had there not been the incident with Jack Aitken, and the irony is Jack Aitken was driving George Russell's car, which created the safety car. Had there not been the Jack Aitken incident, which brought out a safety car, and Mercedes decided to pit both of their cars, which they did not have to do, by the way, because they actually had so much of a gap, they didn't have to actually go and pit the cars. The kerfuffle that happened afterwards, which actually destroyed the race for both Valtteri and for George Russell. Had that not happened, Mercedes drivers, George and Valtteri, and we don't know who would have won because Bottas was catching Russell at one stage. One of the two would have won that race. They would have lapped everybody up to fourth place. This is what is worrying in the world of Formula One. So when drivers like Max Verstappen go out there and try and take on someone like Lewis Hamilton and gets pushed into the wall, which was very unfortunate, and he had a chance. But when he's trying to push someone like Lewis Hamilton, he's driving 10 tenths all of the time. Lewis Hamilton has the luxury, because he's, number one, such a talented driver, but number two, he does have a car that is way superior to anybody else's. Can sit and actually drive at 8.5 tenths. And that's the reality of it at the moment. You've got to feel for Valtteri Bottas. I mean, this was a Grand Prix where the one thing he didn't need to happen was to be beaten by his teammate George Russell. And in qualifying, yes, it was 200ths of a second that separated them, but Valtteri actually won that first fight. He didn't have a good start. Just throughout his whole season, when things have gone wrong, they've happened to Valtteri. And also when they had the pit stop, they went in there, they put the wrong tyres on George Russell's car. Valtteri goes in there, they take his hard tyres off, they put them back on, he's got the same tyres. So yes, he's a very unlucky driver. I don't believe too much in luck, it's just the way that things happen. But he's an incredibly fast racing driver. But I think what we did see also highlights that these youngsters that are in there are most of them are in there purely on their merit, and George Russell proved that without a doubt. The FIA Formula One, I think, work on safety for all forms of motorsport, but specifically Formula One, tirelessly. I think the improvements since the horrific days of Niki Lauda kind of crashes, even going back before that, Francois Sauveur, and then of course 1994 with Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna. That's when all of a sudden Formula One, a lot of notice was taken by the people around the world with the death of Ayrton Senna. The accident with Romain Grosjean at Bahrain was massively worrying. For anybody who's new to Formula One, so I've only been watching perhaps the last 10 years, even the last 20 years, they are not accustomed to seeing Formula One cars burst into flames. So there, even I watched and I went, this is scary, because you don't see these things. In the early 2000s, we had a lot of Honda engines that blew up, but they were not cars that just exploded into fireballs. And this was a horrific accident for Romain Grosjean. So when it comes to the safety, a couple of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, unfortunately, we lost the likes of Jules Bianchi in a very unfortunate incident that happened in Japan. And because of that, the FIA sat and said, we need more protection for the drivers' heads. And they introduced the halo. This halo introduction saved Romain Grosjean's life, without a doubt. We've all seen the pictures, we saw how it actually broke the barrier, and the halo came out unscathed. So motorsport is dangerous, and there's a lot of times, unfortunately, we do become aloof, where we just think, well, nothing's ever going to happen. Anytime, whether it's a kid of 4 years old on a motocross bike or in a go-kart, or it's a kid racing in regional series hatchback cars, you are putting your life in danger. And this was a massive reminder to understand the kinds of risk that Formula One racing drivers and any other racing driver puts themselves into every time they get into a racing vehicle. If you look at the history of Formula One, there have always been 2 or 3 teams who will race at the top. And yes, that does come down to a lot of money. In the future, we're going to have budget caps, and that maybe will tighten things up. But we've always had 2 or 3 teams that have raced at the top. In the last 7 years, we've had 1 team that has raced at the top. Yes, Ferrari have lucked in a few wins, Red Bull have lucked in a few wins, and this year, it's just been fantastic that we've had AlphaTauri who have won a race, and we had Sergio Perez that has won a race. But they've more lucked in than actually beaten Mercedes. And yes, the regulations can be changed, but it has to be consensus amongst everybody. And now, why would Mercedes sit there and agree to allow everybody to just play catch up when they've done such a magnificent job? So this is where it becomes contentious between the various teams. Of course, most people want to see closer racing. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the disparity between the power units has never been this big. And that is where the problem is. Even the Racing Point, which is a 2019 Mercedes-Benz, is still 4 or 5 seconds off the pace of the current Mercedes-Benz. So if they are 4 or 5 seconds off the pace, and most of the other teams are off the pace of Racing Point, just work out the gap yourself. It's way too big. And next year there are some small regulations, but they affect more the aerodynamics of the car than the power units. But there will be more new power units for Ferrari, for Renault, and for Honda, even though they're pulling out of the sport at the end of 2021. But that's the biggest disparity, and it's not just about money, it's about years of development. And Mercedes hit the holy grail when 2014 started, and from there, everybody's been trying to play catch up with all of these restrictions in place. And I think that is what has hurt the sport. The racing point is a very contentious issue because somewhere along the line they found some loophole and bought the 2019 whole rear axle frame of the 2019 Mercedes car. Basically bolted onto theirs, and from there they had the brake ducts that were 2019 Mercedes spec. So it's a very, very contentious issue. However, with Racing Point and being bought out by Lawrence Stroll, he's also a great motivator of people, and he's also turned that team into a hungry team, and they are fighting for every single point. And next year they'll be Aston Martin. So, yes, of course, everyone's taking photographs of all of parts of other cars, but you have to eventually explain the drawings. You have to show the drawings of what you did, and if it is just about the same as Mercedes, you're going to have to explain it. People will still fight about it, but eventually, Renault put up a case against Racing Point, so did Red Bull, so did Ferrari, and everyone dropped it. So, eventually some compromise has been reached somewhere along the line, more than likely to allow the teams to improve their power units going forward. Ferrari have just, ever since the Singapore Grand Prix of 2019, where they together with the FIA, reached an understanding that whatever development Ferrari were doing in their power unit was not the correct way, even though the FIA has come out and said it was not illegal. They have lost their way. And the problem is because they've lost 50 or 60 or 100 horsepower. The car for 2020 was designed to have that extra 60 or 70 or 80 horsepower. And because of that, it would have achieved different speeds, which given it different aerodynamics. And of course, that's how cars are designed. So because they've lost the power in the power unit, unfortunately, it has affected everything. And because of that, as the Italian press and Ferrari is this enigma of Formula One, having a full go at everybody within the team. Plus, on top of that, announcing just at the beginning of May, before the season even started, that they were getting rid of Sebastian Vettel, has also created a tremendous amount of chaos amongst the Italians at Maranello. They will fight back. That is the nature of Ferrari, but who knows if they will be as competitive as they once were. Yeah, Sergio Perez, I suppose, is just very unlucky at the moment. He's without a drive. Alex Albon has not impressed us. But Alexander Albon has youth on his side. Plus, on top of it, don't forget Red Bull is owned by the Austrian, and it's also owned by the Thais. And Alex Albon is an English Thai person. So the chances of them getting rid of Alex Albon, not so great. The way that I see it, if Checo Perez is clever, or has, in terms of his options, he'll go to Ferrari, and he's been there before as a test driver and as a simulator driver, and then step into Alfa Romeo in 2022 to replace Kimi Räikkönen. I think that's an option, unless Albon really bombs out in the final race. Then if Red Bull don't take Perez, then I would question their sanity. I think Alonso comes in with a different kind of maturity as to his previous times in Formula One. However, don't forget Alonso is nearly 40. He's racing against 22-year-olds. There's a huge difference. But, he'll be with Renault and they'll work really, really hard. I think Renault's also improved tremendously. So I think, Alonso will be up there and he'll be challenging. Not entirely sure for victories in 2021, but he'll definitely be up there. I'll be honest, I don't see a lot of difference between Mercedes domination, but if Honda together with Red Bull can really get the aerodynamics right on that car, Max Verstappen is the driver who is the only one, in my opinion, at this stage that can challenge Lewis Hamilton. Give him equal kind of machinery, I'm not saying put them in the same car, but equal kind of machinery, you will see a titanic battle. Africa is the only continent that doesn't have Formula One at the moment. I mean, South Africa, where we live, has got this incredible motorsport history, as does, countries like Kenya, Morocco. They've held Grand Prix before. Of course, Formula One wants to be in Africa. This all comes down to serious money. And this would also, when you're a third world country, to now try and negotiate with the mass population that you're going to be spending billions of rands on a sport I can sit for many minutes and explain to you the merits of having Formula One. But if there was going to be Formula One in Africa, without a doubt, it has to be South Africa. Without a doubt, it has to be at Kyalami. That is the circuit. It is world class. I don't believe in a street circuit in Cape Town. I just think that would be wonderful for a backdrop of Table Mountain. Kyalami is the place if you're going to have a Grand Prix in Africa.